Birds. Written by Daphne du Maurier. Narrated by Edward E. French. Part 2. His wife looked up at Nat, searching his face for confirmation. She looked terrified, bewildered, and he did not want her to know that he was also shaken, dazed almost by the events of the past few hours. "There are birds in there," he said. "Dead birds, nearly 50 of them. Robins, wrens, all the little birds from hereabouts. It's as though a madness seized them, with the east wind." He sat down on the bed beside his wife and held her hand. "It's the weather," he said. "Must be that. It's the hard weather. They aren't the birds, maybe, from here around. They've been driven down from up country." "But, Nat," whispered his wife, "it's only this night that the weather turned. There's been no snow to drive them, and they can't be hungry yet. There's food for them out there in the fields." "It's the weather," repeated Nat. "I tell you, it's the weather." His face, too, was drawn and tired like hers. They stared at one another for a while without speaking. "I'll go downstairs and make a cup of tea," he said. The sight of the kitchen reassured him. The cups and saucers neatly stacked upon the dresser, the table and chairs, his wife's roll of knitting on her basket chair, the children's toys in a corner cupboard. He knelt down, raked out the old embers, and relit the fire. The glowing sticks brought normality, the steaming kettle and the brown teapot comfort and security. He drank his tea, carried a cup up to his wife. Then he washed in the scullery and, putting on his boots, opened the back door. The sky was hard and leaden, and the brown hills that had gleamed in the sun the day before looked dark and bare. The east wind, like a razor, stripped the trees, and the leaves, crackling and dry, shivered and scattered with the wind's blast. Nat stubbed the earth with his boot. It was frozen hard. He had never known a change so swift and sudden. Black winter had descended in a single night. The children were awake now. Jill was chattering upstairs and young Johnny crying once again. Nat heard his wife's voice, soothing, comforting. Presently they came down. He had breakfast ready for them, and the routine of the day began. "Did you drive away the birds?" asked Jill, restored to calm, because of the kitchen fire, because of day, because of breakfast. "Yes. They're all gone now," said Nat. "It was the east wind brought them in. They were frightened and lost. They wanted shelter." "They tried to peck us," said Jill. "They went for Johnny's eyes." "Fright made them do that," said Nat. "They didn't know where they were in the dark bedroom." "I hope they won't come again," said Jill. "Perhaps if we put bread for them outside the window, they will eat that and fly away." She finished her breakfast and then went for her coat and hood, her school books, and her satchel. Nat said nothing, but his wife looked at him across the table. A silent message passed between them. "I'll walk her to the bus," he said. "I don't go to the farm today." And while the child was washing in the scullery, he said to his wife, "Keep all the windows closed, and the doors too, just to be on the safe side. I'll go to the farm, find out if they heard anything in the night." Then he walked with his small daughter up the lane. She seemed to have forgotten her experience of the night before. She danced ahead of him, chasing the leaves, her face whipped with the cold and rosy under the pixie hood. "Is it going to snow, Dad?" she said. "It's cold enough." He glanced up at the bleak sky, felt the wind tear at his shoulders. "No," he said, "it's not going to snow. This is a black winter, not a white one." All the while he searched the hedgerows for the birds, glanced over the top of them to the fields beyond, looked to the small wood above the farm where the rooks and jackdaws gathered. He saw none. The other children waited by the bus stop, muffled, hooded like Jill, the faces white and pinched with cold. Jill ran to them, waving. "My dad says it won't snow," she called. "It's going to be a black winter." She said nothing of the birds. She began to push and struggle with another little girl. The bus came ambling up the hill. Nat saw her onto it, then turned and walked back toward the farm. It was not his day for work, but he wanted to satisfy himself that all was well. Jim, the cowman, was chattering in the yard. "Boss around?" asked Nat. "Gone to market," said Jim. "It's Tuesday, isn't it?" He clumped off round the corner of a shed. He had no time for Nat. Nat was said to be superior, read books and the like. Nat had forgotten it was Tuesday. This showed how the events of the preceding night had shaken him. He went to the back door of the farmhouse and heard Mrs. Trigg singing in the kitchen, the wireless making a background to her song. "Are you there, missus?" called out Nat. She came to the door, beaming, broad, a good-tempered woman. "Hello, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Can you tell me where this cold is coming from? Is it Russia? I've never seen such a change. And it's going on, the wireless says. Something to do with the Arctic Circle." "We didn't turn on the wireless this morning," said Nat. "Fact is, we had trouble in the night." "Kiddies poorly?" "No." He hardly knew how to explain it. Now, in daylight, the Battle of the Birds would sound absurd. He tried to tell Mrs. Trigg what had happened, but he could see from her eyes that she thought his story was the result of a nightmare. "Sure they were real birds," she said, smiling, "with proper feathers and all. Not the funny-shaped kind that men see after closing hours on a Saturday night." "Mrs. Trigg," he said, "there are 50 dead birds. Robins, wrens, and such lying low on the floor of the children's bedroom. They went for me. They tried to go for young Johnny's eyes." Mrs. Trigg stared at him doubtfully. "Well, there now," she answered. "I suppose the weather brought them once in the bedroom. They wouldn't know where they were to. Foreign birds, maybe. From that Arctic Circle." "No," said Nat. "They were birds you see about here every day." "Funny thing," said Mrs. Trigg. "No explaining it, really. You ought to write up and ask the Guardian. They'd have some answer for it. Well, I must be getting on." She nodded, smiled, and went back to the kitchen. Nat, dissatisfied, turned to the farm gate. Had it not been for those corpses on the bedroom floor, which he must now collect and bury somewhere, he would have considered the tale exaggeration too. Jim was standing by the gate. "Had any trouble with the birds?" asked Nat. "Birds? What birds? We got them up our place last night. Scores of them. Came in the children's window. Quite savage they were." "Oh?" It took time for anything to penetrate Jim's head. "Never heard of birds acting savage," he said at length. "They get tame-like sometimes. I've seen them come to the windows for crumbs. These birds last night weren't tame." "No?" "Cold, maybe. Hungry. You put out some crumbs." Jim was no more interested than Mrs. Trigg had been. It was, Nat thought, like air raids in the war. No one down this end of the country knew what the Plymouth folk had seen and suffered. You had to endure something yourself before it touched you. He walked back along the lane and crossed the stile to his cottage. He found his wife in the kitchen with young Johnny. "See anyone?" she asked. "Mrs. Trigg and Jim," he answered. "I don't think they believed me. Anyway, nothing's wrong up there." "You might take the birds away," she said. "I daren't go into the room to make the beds until you do. I'm scared." "Nothing to scare you now," said Nat. "They're dead, aren't they?" He went up with a sack and dropped the stiff bodies into it one by one. Yes, there were 50 of them all told, just the ordinary common birds of the hedgerow, nothing as large even as a thrush. It must have been fright that made them act the way they did. Blue tits, wrens. It was incredible to think of the power of their small beaks jabbing at his face and hands the night before. He took the sack out into the garden and was faced now with a fresh problem. The ground was too hard to dig. It was frozen solid, yet no snow had fallen. Nothing had happened in the past hours but the coming of the east wind. It was unusual queer. The weather prophets must be right. The change was something connected to the Arctic Circle. The wind seemed to cut him to the bone as he stood there uncertainly, holding the sack. He could see the white-capped seas breaking down under the bay. He decided to take the birds to the shore and bury them. When he reached the beach below the headland, he could scarcely stand. The force of the east wind was so strong. It hurt to draw breath, and his bare hands were blue. Never had he known such cold, not in all the bad winters he could remember. He crunched his way over the shingle to the softer sand, and then, his back to the wind, ground a pit in the sand with his heel. He meant to drop the birds into it, but as he opened up the sack, the force of the wind carried them, lifted them, as though in flight again, and they were blown away from him along the beach, tossed like feathers, spread and scattered, the bodies of the 50 frozen birds. There was something ugly in the sight. He did not like it. The dead birds were swept away from him by the wind. The tide will take them when it turns, he said to himself. He looked out to sea and watched the crested breakers combing green. They rose stiffly, curled, and broke again, and because it was ebb tide, the roar was distant, more remote, lacking the sound and thunder of the flood. Then he saw them. The gulls, out there riding the seas. What he had thought at first to be the white caps of the waves were gulls. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. They rose and fell in the trough of the seas, heads to the wind, like a mighty fleet at anchor waiting on the tide. To eastward and to the west the gulls were there. They stretched as far as his eye could reach, in close formation, line upon line. Had the sea been still, they would have covered the bay like a white cloud, head to head, body packed to body. Only the east wind, whipping the sea to breakers, hid them from the shore. Nat turned, and leaving the beach, climbed the steep path home. Someone should know of this. Someone should be told. Something was happening, because of the east wind and the weather, that he did not understand. He wondered if he should go to the call box by the bus stop and ring up the police. Yet what could they do? What could anyone do? Tens of thousands of gulls riding the sea there in the bay because of storm. Because of hunger.